The July and August issue of Beyond Adventure is Joe Shute's profound and important forecast. It's a reflection on our connection and disconnection from the changing seasons. Now then, my sheltered corner, which seems an appropriate place. Start reading from Joe Shute's forecast, which compiles his experience as the Telegraph's weather correspondent. Now there's a job, weather correspondent. It compiles a series of stories from his experience as their weather correspondent, where he was instructed to write about anything but the weather, which I think is quite a good thing. So he tells a series of stories which are all about our interaction, our connection with, our disconnect from the weather. And one of those stories is based right here on Saddleworth Moor. So we'll crack on. This is quite a personal one for me, as you'll see why later on. The scars are growing fainter now, though a shadow remains scorched into the earth across Saddleworth Moor. On one side of the firebreak, the bilberry bushes are fruiting, and emerald green patches of sphagnum moss shine like spotlights on the moorland grass. On the other side, across the blackened peatland, the first shoots of heather are just beginning to emerge from the skeletal ruins of the worst English wildfire in living memory. It's a year on from the Saddleworth Moor fire of 2018, and I'm standing with Kate Hanley, the RSB site manager for the moor, at the demarcation line, denoting the point where it was finally brought under control. In total, around 1,000 hectares of moorland were consumed in the wildfire, which broke out on the 24th of June and burnt for weeks. The smoke billowed across Manchester, 13 miles away, creating an ash cloud over the city, which turned the sun red and temporarily lowered temperatures by 3 degrees C. NASA satellite images confirmed the fire was visible from space. 3 degrees C. It's crazy. The impact of just one fire in a place like this. That summer, it seemed as if all of Europe was in flames. In Greece, the government declared a state of emergency after wildfires destroyed the Aegean coastal resort of Mati, killing around 100 people. In total, 178,000 hectares of land was destroyed by wildfire across Europe in 2018. And while that tally was actually less than the previous year, the shock was the number of countries involved. Sweden suffered the worst year in its history. Norway, Ukraine and Latvia were also badly affected. And at one stage in mid-July, 11 separate wildfires raged inside the Arctic Circle. That tells you something, doesn't it? Forecast. From Saddleworth Moor to the tundra of the far north, the blame was largely placed upon the weather. Records were being broken across the northern hemisphere after what had already been the second hottest June on record. Britain was engulfed in its third longest heatwave in history. As Saddleworth Moor was burning, firefighters also spent weeks trying to put out a similar-sized blaze in Winterhill in Lancashire, which at its peak covered an area of 7 square miles of moorland. Aside from the more visible species, such as curlew, dunlin, golden plover and hares, the moors sustain an intricate web of life. I think of the adders and the common lizards I spotted secreted beneath the moorland bracken of Herefordshire, and understand the sheer destructive capacity of a wildfire. On Saddleworth and Winter Hill, entire ecosystems were wiped out in an instant. Experts said they could take years to recover, if indeed they ever could, as such fires were now becoming an annual occurrence. Britain's uplands have seen much of their natural resistance to fire stripped away over centuries of mismanagement, which has led to them being left in a state of ecological crisis. Saddleworth Moor is a case in point. Much of its peat-forming sphagnum moss has disappeared over the past century or so, and the wetlands have been drained, creating a monoculture of highly flammable heather. Although in recent years there have been efforts to restore blanket bog habitats on parts of the moor, and similar work taking place elsewhere. Large parts of the uplands have also been given over to the intensive rearing and shooting of red grouse, which has similarly increased its susceptibility to wildfire. In many instances, gamekeepers seasonally burn large areas of moorland themselves, as the tender shoots of young heather are deemed to benefit the grouse. There are increasing steps to outlaw this, but each year when the burning season begins in October, smoke still rises from some of the grouse moors in the countryside near me. This combination of draining, burning and overgrazing means the land is less able to withstand flooding and wildfire, just at the very moment when, due to the carbon we continue to release into the atmosphere, those climatic pressures are rapidly increasing. Which is why it's called Forecast. Because that's what each of Joe's stories tell us. Our disconnect with the natural world. Even blaming it as an enemy sometimes. The weather isn't an enemy, it's part of nature, the same as we are. So there you go. To do the cheesy. Hey. I don't think you can see Manchester from here. You can see it from over the tops. It's a spectacular place. It's the great thing about doing this job. You have an excuse to come out to all sorts of places that you've never visited before. I think I'll be back now. Anyway, let's move on. Won't work if you don't turn the camera on. Now then, back again. I was meant to be down the hill for a more authentic downstream environment. However, you can't miss this light, can you? But all that water racing off the moors had to end up somewhere. By the cold economics through which flood defence priorities are calculated, as a main urban conurbation, Sheffield is deemed more a priority than the smaller towns and villages downstream. Similar calculations. Okay, right. This is where. So I'm reading this book, Forecast, Joe Shute, and I get to this bit, and I'm like, oh yeah, because I know Sheffield. Grew up near Sheffield. And I get to this bit, and I'm like, I know that name. So similar calculations would have been made 4 centuries ago, when in 1626 King Charles I commissioned the Dutch engineer Cornelius Vermuyden to drain the marshy lowlands of South Yorkshire, North Nottinghamshire and North Lincolnshire, known as Hatfield Chase, to create new swathes of agricultural land. I know that name because that's where I grew up. In the very flat bit, which is not quite the right setting here, is it? Anyway, it's in relation to it. Everything that starts here ends up down there, doesn't it? Within 18 months, Vermuyden had changed the course of the River Don. An estimated 12,400 hectares of fenland was reclaimed during the work, and ownership was divided into 3 parts between Vermuyden, the Crown, and existing tenants who claimed the right of common over the chase. The manor of Fishlake was among the land holdings granted to Vermuyden. I kind of knew that Fishlake was going to appear because something happened at Fishlake, as Joe will tell us in a minute, but it's quite pertinent to me. Anyway, let's carry on and you'll see. Established on what was then the banks of the River Don, the village takes its name from the Old Norse meaning fish stream. Residents had grown wealthy, harvesting riverfish and eels, and establishing ferrying services and a port along the Don. Situated in low-lying countryside and close to several major rivers with a predominantly clay soil, the area had always been susceptible to flooding. But land drainage was effectively maintained by a complex system of medieval field dikes, still visible today. But then, according to the Fishlake Historical Society, there are numerous references in the in the pre-1627 accounts in the parish bylaw book to the land being improved, gripped and goitered, cut through with gullies to improve the surface drainage. Vermuyden and his fellow Dutch engineers violently disrupted this centuries-old balance. Rerouting the River Don eventually took it south of Fish Lake and stripped the floodplains of their abilities to store water. In time, new meaning would be attached to the village's historic name. The Don, which runs about 30 miles from Sheffield to Fish Lake, the Don runs about 30 miles from Sheffield to Fish Lake, and in November 2019, during the continued rains over the course of the next few days, it was here that the worst of the flooding occurred. I visited on Monday, 2 days after the Don had burst its banks and engulfed the village. I wanted to talk to the residents about their own experience of an event that in part my city had caused. In the matter of a few steps, my wellies had entirely filled and the freezing water gnawed at my toes. A man in camouflage bum bag carrying fishing waders carrying a USB charging point in a bum bag, there you go, my bum bag confusion, helped people power their phones, wallowed over. He talked me through what had happened. The Environment Agency had only warned people late on Friday night there was a serious threat to life and that they should evacuate immediately. But then he said there were some simply unable to leave their homes, while others had decided to remain in the village because they were afraid of looters. He told me people had been sleeping in the local pub. The church, meanwhile, had been turned into a rescue centre. Now, this is the crazy bit. So, you know, sometimes you find a book and you think that's going to be a great book. And that was the case with Forecast. And then I'm already really enjoying all these stuff about, you know, it's based in the north, which no nature books ever are. Even, you know, the part of the north that I grew up in, which is a very flat and boring bit, which I never thought would be worth writing about. And then this happens. Our conversation was interrupted by a man called Peter, a neighbourhood watch officer who was one of Fish Lake's volunteer flood coordinators. Now, as soon as we got to talking about Fish Lake, I had an inkling this might happen, because Peter appeared on the news when this happened, and I recognised him as my old geography teacher. So our July and August Beyond Adventure feature includes my geography teacher. Now, how crazy is that? Peter's beautiful mid-18th century home had now languished under several feet of water. So far, he'd been refusing interviews with journalists making their way into the village, but he was interested to hear I was writing a weather book and invited me into his wife's office in an outhouse where the family had decamped. I bet he was interested. That sounds just like Pete, or Trimo, as we called him. He told me he'd lived in the village his whole life and was only aware of 2 floods on this scale before to have affected Fish Lake, in 1923 and 1947. The speed at which the water came into the village at this time, though, was unprecedented. He didn't wish to go into too much detail about the extent of damage he'd suffered personally. Suffice to say furniture, fittings, electrics and the rest. The family's Labrador, meanwhile, had been loaned out to friends in preference to being marooned in the outhouse. A geographer by training, he put the scale of the damage down to 3 factors: freak weather, global warming, and our destruction of the resilience of the land. The inability of the moors to hold back water to prevent flooding is the same thing now that makes them so susceptible to wildfire. I work from peak to peak, he told me, reflecting on his time studying as a geographer, and the speed at which rainfall could flood down from the moors into the valleys below. When I was a younger lad, it took 24 hours to run off the moors. Now, my suspicion, it's only 12 hours. It's caused by how we manage the uplands above Sheffield, but also through the concrete jungle of the city. Then they exacerbate it by not doing anything about it elsewhere. Working downriver, eventually, someone's going to cop it. And that someone was Peter and everyone else living in the village of Fish Lake. And I think it is easy to forget when you're all the way up here on the Pennine backbone that everything that happens here affects everywhere else. And we seem to have forgotten that. It's not all we've forgotten. The story of the storms, which you'll have to read the book to discover, matters to me because it represents something that's been lost. Over the centuries, a rich and distinctive vocabulary has evolved across the British Isles, linking people, place and weather. These weather words possess a delicacy and intensity of focus that pinpoint the experience of communities and generations that have watched the seasons come and go. They denote the power of the weather to shape us and provide a sense of local identity. And as the seasons themselves grow homogenised, as our climate changes, so the very words we once used precisely to describe the weather and its effects on us are drifting silently into oblivion. This rich lexicon is derived from mariners, fishermen, farmers, miners, communities in the furthest corners of the British Isles whose lives were dependent upon the seasons. The modern era has seen a hollowing out of many of those communities and the work that defined them dwindle. As our society has urbanised, the young have been drawn into towns and cities and not returned. With the passing wave of each generation, the language, of the countryside at least, has blunted. We're losing our weather words because sadly, simply, we no longer have need for them. Which is a great example of how Joe's book really looks at our connection and our disconnection with the natural world. It's exactly the sort of thing that I think outdoor folk will enjoy, and that's why I chose it for July and August. From this lovely moor, this lovely light, I will bid you farewell. Actually, that sun is going down, so I'm going to need to get off.